So our paper is called Spinoza and Nietzsche on Valuing. The first thing I should say is that we're not interested in talking about Nietzsche's response to Spinoza. As I think has been amply demonstrated already, Nietzsche's construal of Spinoza is not a great event in the history of scholarship. But what we'd rather do is compare Spinoza and Nietzsche's theory of valuing, make our own comparison. I think there are some interesting points of contact and some interesting points at which they diverge. And we want to focus on valuing rather than value. So we're interested in what Spinoza and Nietzsche have to say about the human activity of finding things valuable, finding things good, valuing things, not in the theory of what actually makes things valuable, or what value is. It's a theory about a human activity, not a theory about kind of metaphysics, values out there in the world, or anything like that. So the point of contact, I think, is that Nietzsche and Spinoza both think of valuing in a fairly idiosyncratic way. So one standard way of thinking about valuing is that it's a kind of relation between a valuing subject and whatever object the subject is valuing. It's a kind of linear relationship between those two things. And Spinoza and Nietzsche both reject that picture and have a very different picture of how valuing works. But their alternative accounts are quite different. So what we'll do is I'm going to outline Spinoza's theory of valuing as we understand it. And then Christoph will outline Nietzsche's theory, and then we'll explain how Nietzsche's position actually helps to realize some of the weaknesses in Spinoza's theory, and Spinoza's position helps us to realize some of the weaknesses in Nietzsche's theory, and then we'll really just leave it there, open out for discussion. So the distinction between valuing and value, between the idea of having a theory of valuing, of the activity of valuing and value itself, is a distinction that Nietzsche explicitly makes, as Christoph will explain. It's not a distinction that Spinoza makes, but I'm not convinced that Spinoza has a theory of value at all. I'm not convinced that he has a theory of what makes things good or valuable. He very rarely says anything about that, if ever. He has a lot to say about how it is that people find things valuable, what the causes of people valuing things are, but I don't think he has much at all to say about value as such. Because I think Spinoza scholars haven't realized this as much as maybe they should have, there are confusions that inevitably emerge in the interpretation of Spinoza's moral philosophy. So Andrew Buper, just to pick on someone at random really, thinks that there's this tension between two different accounts of valuing in Spinoza's ethics. So the first account he calls a desire-satisfaction account of valuing, and the second one he calls a perfectionist theory of valuing. So the desire-satisfaction account is given at the scholium to proposition 39 of book 3 of the ethics, 3P39S. I'm just going to abbreviate like that from now on, otherwise Christoph probably won't have a chance to talk. So 3P39S, Spinoza says we don't desire something because it's good, we call things good because we desire them. So that, to Buper, says that Spinoza has a theory of value according to which things are valuable when we desire them. That's what makes something valuable. I don't think that's right. I think that that's a theory about when we value things, not a theory about what value is as such. But the second account of value that Buper finds in Spinoza is in the preface to the fourth part of the Ethics, where Spinoza says that by good he understands what brings us nearer to a model of human perfection that we set before ourselves. And this is something that Moore and Paul's paper talked about, and Don's paper had quite a lot to say about as well. And so Buper calls this a perfectionist theory of value. So as theories of value, they look like they're opposed. One says things are good when we desire them. The other says things are good when they bring us nearer to some model of perfection. If you see these as theories of valuing instead of theories of value, I think you can see that they're actually the same theory. And I think you can see that when you look at something that, if you realize these are theories of valuing, you see that you should look at, which is Spinoza's theory of desire. Spinoza has, I think, a very interesting and fairly idiosyncratic theory of desire, which I think is a kind of theory of mimetic desire. And mimetic desire is a term that's associated with René Girard, and I think Spinoza's theory is pretty close to Girard's. So Girard's theory really revolves around two theses. It's quite simple. The first is that desire is what he calls metaphysical, meaning just that all desire is the desire to be. That's how he expresses it at one point. All desire is fundamentally desire to be a particular kind of subject. Desire is not fundamentally desire for particular objects, it's a desire to be in a particular way. You only want things insofar as you think that those things, you might not do this consciously, of course, but you only want things insofar as you think that those things will help you to be a certain kind of person. And that, I think, is definitely a theory that Spinoza has at 3P9S. He says that desire is nothing other than our striving to persevere in being along with consciousness of that striving. So there's some confusion in this idea of persevering in being. So Spinoza thinks that everyone, in fact everything, strives insofar as it can to persevere in its being. And it's not really obvious what that means. I mean, if you strive to persevere in being, it means you have to have some idea of what it is that you're trying to remain as, right? So I can say, well, I just strive to remain in the form that I'm in. Well, under what description? If I fall into a crocodile pit, I climb out of the crocodile pit. Why? Well, because I want to persevere in being. But I want to persevere in being what? I want to persevere in being an intact human being or something. I don't want to persevere in being a man in a crocodile pit, otherwise I would stay in the crocodile pit, wouldn't I? Right? Or tomorrow I could go to the taxidermist and get myself stuffed, and then I could hang around for ages and ages like Jeremy Bentham. Why don't I do that? Well, because I don't want to just remain a kind of piece of matter in this vague shape. I want to remain, the living man. So persevere in being is description relative. That's one way you could think about it. So out of all the things that we are, which of them, out of all the descriptions that we can be captured under, which of them is what we regard as our being? It's very important. Spinoza doesn't say all things strive to persevere in being. He says all things strive to persevere in their being. He says everything strives to perseverare in suo esse, right? It's not just remain existing, it's remain in its existence, its kind of particular existence, the thing that it takes, well, the thing that essentially defines it. So there I think Spinoza starts to go towards what I think is the second Girardian thesis, which is that all desire is social. So how does that transition work? Well, once you realize that your fundamental striving, your fundamental desire is to be something, where do you get the idea of what it is that you want to be? Where do you arrive at that from? I think for Spinoza, you arrive at it by adopting someone else as a model. You adopt another subject as the model for what it is you're desiring to be, you're striving to be. Where do I get that from? Well, I think it's not explicit, but one pretty relevant passage in the Ethics is 3P31C, where Spinoza is defending the proposition that anybody who loves something or hates something, or I think really just desires things or has any kind of connotative relationship to something, strives that others also love or hate that thing, desire that thing. But it's very important that when Spinoza is explaining why that's true, he quotes these two lines from Ovid's Amores, which people don't talk about very much. I think they're really important. So the lines say, the first line is, as lovers let us hope and fear together. Let us hope and fear together. And the next line, which can't be translated literally, says, Ferius est, si quis quod sinit alter amat. Which Spinoza, I think, reads as something like, whoever can love what somebody else overlooks, condemns, despises, is indifferent towards, must be made of iron. And that's not a complimentary thing. It's not like Superman being the man of steel. It's kind of what we would express by saying something, well, you must be some kind of robot if you can do that. If you can love something that somebody else is just indifferent to, then you must be made of iron. Why? Well, I think it's because Spinoza thinks that desire is fundamentally emulative. Why would it be the case that I find it impossible to desire some object unless other people desire it? I think it's because the condition of desiring that object is perceiving somebody else desiring it. And that's what Girard means when he says that desire is mimetic, right? You desire things by modelling yourself on somebody else who desires those things. Why? Because you want to be like your model. You see your model desiring it, you want to be like your model, so you also end up desiring it. The reason why we do that for Spinoza, I think, has to do with this notion that desire is striving to be a certain way plus consciousness of that striving. Well, how do you become conscious of what it is that you're striving to be? You might think by introspection. You just sort of look deep into yourself and see what it is that you're striving to be. I don't think that's possible. I don't think Spinoza thinks that's possible. The next time you're in a situation where you really don't know what you want, see whether it helps to look deep into yourself and kind of sound out your heart's longings. If it doesn't help, and I suspect it won't, Spinoza has a reason. And the reason is, and this is 2p27, the mind doesn't know itself except insofar as it's affected by other things. Spinoza just thinks, for various reasons, which I won't go into, the human mind doesn't have knowledge of itself through introspection. Self-knowledge is attained by looking at other people who we perceive to be like ourselves. These are among the things, of course, that affect us from the outside. And inferring, well, they're similar to me, so if they seem to be striving after something, then I must be striving after that as well. That, I think, is the mechanism of mimetic desire for Spinoza. So once you see that, I think you can see that these two different accounts of valuing, one which says that we value what we desire, and the other that says we value what brings us closer to some model of human perfection, are in fact the same, because the structure of desire is mediated by this model. Desiring something is thinking that it brings you nearer to some model of human perfection, right? That's what it means to desire something. That's what desiring something consists in. As I think Thorstein Veblen put it, the motive that lies at the root of all ownership is emulation. It's a statement that I think is more valuable than the whole of modern microeconomic theory, but that's a separate issue. The motive that lies at the root of all ownership is emulation. The reason we want things is because we emulate others who want them. So what accounts for the difference between the sort of theory of valuing that Spinoza gives in the third part of the Ethics and the theory of valuing that Spinoza gives in the fourth part of the Ethics is not structural. It's not that these are different theories of valuing. It's the same theory of valuing. What makes all the difference is what is adopted. Again, this might not be conscious, but what's adopted by the subject as the model for the subject's desire. In the third part of the Ethics, I think Spinoza is thinking about what Girard calls internal mediation. Internal mediation is where the model that mediates your desires is someone present to you, someone who you actually interact with. And Girard thinks this is an extremely dangerous kind of situation to be in, where the model for your desires is someone who you're actually existing alongside in the world. Why? Well, think about a case where there's something that only one person can possess. What happens? Your model wants that thing. Because your model wants that thing, you also want that thing. So you kind of try to take it from your model. The more your model strives to hold on to it, the more you'll strive to take it for yourself. You'll want to possess it. Of course, if the model just gives it up readily, then you know that they didn't really want it, and so the condition of your own desire has disappeared. Also, emulation works both ways, right? The model is also, to an extent, modeling herself on you. So the more you strive to take something from her, the more she strives to hold on to it, because the condition of each subject's desire is the desire of the other subject. And this just leads to conflict and rivalry, inevitably. Inevitably. In fact, right after the bit that I quoted where I think Spinoza comes the closest to outlining this mimetic theory of desire, so this is proposition 32 of the third book of the Ethics, he says that when someone imagines that, when someone desires something that only one person can possess, they strive that others don't possess that thing. That's obvious, but notice he does not say they strive that the other person doesn't desire that thing. That would, if desire is mimetic in the way that I'm suggesting it is, that would eliminate the condition of your own desire. So what I think happens in the fourth part of the Ethics is Spinoza finds a way of modelling your desires, finding a model to mediate your desires, that doesn't lead to this kind of conflict. So there was this issue that came up with Paul and Mora's paper about why it should be important. Sorry, well, first I'll just say what the theory is. So the theory is fairly simple. Spinoza says that you put before yourself a model of human rationality. So that the model for your desire is now not somebody that you're interacting with, it's this kind of abstract idea of this sort of model of human rationality. That's what now becomes the model of your desire. So you kind of construct this sort of fictional ideal person that becomes the model for your desires. Again, I don't know how much choice you're really meant to have about all of this. This might just be something that happens to people who are particularly blessed. But you can see, first of all, because it's fictional, so this is a case of what Girard calls external mediation. The model is now something that's not in your world, it's something that's kind of outside in some abstract realm. Girard likes to use the example of Don Quixote. Don Quixote models himself on a character who he can't possibly interact with, which is Amadis of Gaul, who's a knight errant who lived many centuries ago. So that, in a way, helps Don Quixote because he never actually has to become a rival for Amadis of Gaul. It's obviously impossible for him because Amadis of Gaul, for him, is basically fictional. I like the example of Don Quixote because it's the kind of literature that Spinoza probably, it's the kind of literature that Spinoza liked, right? These sort of picaresque stories, which often have, it's not just Don Quixote, they often have this idea of mimetic desire in them, one way or another. People taking on models for themselves. But it's not just enough for the model to be fictional to prevent conflict and rivalry from emerging. It's also really important that the model is a kind of ideal picture of human rationality. And why is that? Well, because for Spinoza, the ideally rational person only desires things that everyone can share in. The ideally rational person will never desire something that only some people can possess. The ideally rational person likes things like knowledge, especially, but also other things, music and the beauty of green plants and things like that. Why? Well, because, various reasons, I think. But one reason is it would be irrational, once you know that desire is mimetic, to want to possess something that only one person can possess, because you see that ends up being a self-defeating sort of desire, because the more you desire it, the more someone else will have to desire it, and the more that is, right? It just doesn't, there's maybe a kind of vaguely Kantian idea here that you have to be able to universalize your desire and still make sense out of it, to possess that desire rationally. So that, I think, is why it's so important for Spinoza not only that what you pick as a model should be something other than a person who you interact with, it's also really important that it's a picture of human rationality, kind of model who only desires things that everyone can possess equally. No, I mean, you notice that also frees you from the problem of having other people take you as a model and then getting into rivalries with them, right? So it might be all very well that you yourself model your desires on somebody who you're not interacting with, but what about people who interact with you? If they start modeling themselves on you and you desire things that only one can possess, then you'll still end up in these conflicts. So I think that might be part of the answer to the issue that came up with Paul and Moira's paper about why it should be so important that when you adopt a model as a rational person, you consciously adopt a fictional model. If you adopt a fictional model who you don't really know is fictional, you're not going to think through whether that is really going to spare you from the sorts of mimetic conflict that the adoption of, that the whole nature of desire can lead you into. So I think really you just have one theory of desire in Spinoza, one theory of value in Spinoza that's based on this idea of mimetic desire, and I think that the kind of account that you're given in the fourth part of the Ethics is a way of dealing with the fact that we just do desire in that way without it leading to interminable conflicts. And that's basically the theory of valuing that I want to outline for Spinoza. But you can see that what's really important here is that valuing is no longer a linear relationship between a valuing subject and a valued object. There's this extra thing, which is crucially important. It's a triangular relationship among the valuing subject, the object, and the model, the extra subject that's kind of mediating the desires. So I'll leave that there for the time being and then turn it over to Christoph to talk about Nietzsche's theory of valuing.
Great, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a picture of Nietzsche's account of what valuing is, which is going to be garnered largely from his late writings and notebooks from 1885 to 88, as well as in some of the published writings. And as Alex mentioned, Nietzsche actually makes a clear conceptual distinction between valuing, on the one hand, the activity of valuing as something that we do, and values on the other. And it's very important that this is not to be thought of in the sense that some dispositionalist theorists of value hold, which is that a value is simply what we're disposed to value. So it's not that valuing as an activity simply issues in values. There's a much more complex relationship between our valuing activities and the values that we hold for Nietzsche, which I'm not going to go into. There's a complex meta-ethical story that he has to tell about how what he calls valuing becomes transformed into values. So the conceptual distinction that he uses is reflected in his language. So he has, for valuing, the term wertschätzen, or cognates such as schätzen and abschätzen, whereas for values he has Werte. This is something that's been very clearly brought out in various pieces of writing on Nietzsche by John Richardson, but it's something that is very, very often missed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the picture of valuing that I think Nietzsche presents in as much detail as I can, and then suggest that there's some analogy with Spinoza in the sense that from this account flows some account of what superior valuing of a particular kind is. But then I also want to draw a wedge between Spinoza and Nietzsche, because I think it'll become very clear that it's not at all in the spirit of what Nietzsche wants to do to set up exemplars of the kind that Spinoza has in mind. So he doesn't have a model of superior valuing. So the picture that Nietzsche draws of what valuing is involves drawing very tight connections between valuing, will to power, and drives. So I'm going to outline what I think are the 5 central claims that he makes, which are very tightly connected. So he claims, first of all, that we are creatures who engage in valuing. Valuing is something which we do and which is essential to the kind of creatures that we are. Secondly, valuing is the expression of drives. And Nietzsche holds that the drives that do our valuing are inherently valuative. He often makes statements to the effect that drives are things that value. Thirdly, what I am is a collection of such drives. So I'm to think of myself as some particular configuration at any point in time, which involves not just an assembly of drives, but it involves a certain kind of hierarchical arrangement of drives, in which the drives which he thinks of as antagonistic towards each other and as competing with each other and conflicting with each other end up in a certain sort of arrangement in which certain of the drives are in a superior position in relation to other drives. So there's a complex hierarchical structure. Now he thinks furthermore that I am not a subject, but I am this collection of drives. And this implies that the extent to which I am a unified individual is a matter of degree. So we can ascribe a certain view of the subject to Nietzsche, if we want to use that terminology, but the subject will be nothing more than the collection of drives arranged in a particular hierarchy. Fourthly, valuing operates in accordance with the will to power. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Essentially, he thinks that valuing just is the expression of will to power. Fifthly, and very importantly, drives in their valuing activity do not inherently have an object. So the object onto which the valuing drive attaches itself can be varied, and very often is varied. So I'm going to take these claims one by one and just say a little bit about what Nietzsche has to say about them. So firstly, the claim that we are creatures that value is something that recurs again and again in Nietzsche's late work. So in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra speaks of man as the esteemer or valuer. And we read on the genealogy of morality that perhaps our word man, manas, still expresses precisely something of this self-esteem. Man designated himself as the being who measures values, who values and measures as the appraising animal in itself, das abschätzende Tier an sich. So he has this view of human beings as being essentially valuers and engaging in valuing. And he certainly thinks that human beings are valuers par excellence, as these passages bring out, where he's saying that manas still shows us something of the centrality of valuing to human beings in particular, but he thinks, in fact, that valuing is something that is at the root of all life, however basic. So there's a passage in the Nachlass of 1884 where he writes, "Higher and lower, the selecting of the more important, more useful, more pressing, arises already in the lowest organisms. Alive, that means already valuing, schätzen. In all, willing is valuing, and will is there in the organic." And again he writes in Twilight of the Idols, the passage, Morality's Anti-Nature, section 5, "When we speak of values, we speak with the inspiration, with a way of looking at things which is part of life. Life itself forces us to posit values. Life itself values through us when we posit values." So I now want to turn to the second claim that I referred to, which is that the activity of valuing is performed, according to Nietzsche, by our drives. So he thinks that valuing is the drive's characteristic activity. That's to say, where there are drives, there is valuing. So then the question is, what does Nietzsche mean? What is his conception of drives? Well, it's important to his conception of drives that they're distinguished from desires. So a desire is something which can wax and wane. A desire is something which can be satisfied and then disappear, whereas a drive is something which constantly reasserts itself, according to Nietzsche. So I want to take over characterization of Nietzsche's conception of the drive from a recent piece of writing by Paul Katsafanos, who says, a Nietzschean drive is a particular type of disposition which manifests itself by generating an evaluative orientation. So it's particularly important here that drives are not homunculi, they're not little centers of agency that together make up the full-scale agent. So if it were the case that Nietzsche thought that drives were these little centers of agency in themselves, then we would have the problem that at best this would spectacularly lack explanatory power, because we've simply moved the onus of explaining how we have agency onto these little homunculi, which we understand no better than the agent as a whole. Or at worst, it's viciously circular. We have no account of where the agency of these drives comes from itself. So the claim that drives are inherently valuative is one that Nietzsche makes again in late Nachlass passages. So in 1884 he writes, "Every drive is the drive to something good, seen from some standpoint." And these drives themselves compete with each other for evaluative supremacy. So he writes, "It is our needs that interpret the world, our drives and their for and against. Every drive is a kind of lust to rule. Each one has its perspective that it would like to compel all the other drives to accept as a norm." Now, a feature of this conception is that Nietzsche furthermore thinks that all our higher intellectual processes are in some sense processes that mask the activity of drives. And valuing is for him in some sense prior to all higher mental functioning and even permeates all of it. So he writes that our thinking and valuating is only an expression for, in this case, desires, Begehrungen, at work behind them in Nachlass of 1885 to 86, which is something that Nietzsche will make use of, notably in relation to Spinoza, where he writes in Beyond Good and Evil 25, a passage worth quoting because it's one of the many places where Nietzsche condemns Spinoza. "These outcasts of society, these long-pursued, wickedly persecuted ones, also the compulsory recluses, the Spinozas or Giordano Brunos, always become in the end, even under the most spiritual masquerade, and perhaps without them being themselves aware of it, sophisticated vengeance-seekers and poison-brewers. Let someone lay bare the foundation of Spinoza's ethics and theology, not to speak of the stupidity of moral indignation, which is the unfailing sign in a philosopher that his philosophical sense of humour has left him." So make what you will of this ascription of the function of drives even to higher intellectual processes, but this is just to show that for Nietzsche, the activity of valuing through drives is something that, for him, characterizes all of our cognitive processes. So now, thirdly, the claim that we are ourselves collections of drives rather than subjects. Nietzsche claims that insofar as I have agency, it is as a collection of drives that I have it. So the particular constellation in which my drives stand and the hierarchical relations between them make me the agent I am. So in general, he thinks, in most cases, in the case of most human beings, these drives do not cohere to form a convincing, harmonious whole. So there are many places where Nietzsche talks about so-called incomplete men. And there are many Nachlass passages in which he talks about this. And then in Zarathustra himself tells us, "I walk among men as among the fragments of the future, that future which I envisage. And this is all my creating and striving, that I create and carry together into one what is fragment and riddle and dreadful accident." So for Zarathustra, there is the prospect of achieving true subjectivity in the sense of the unification of the drives, but it's something that's very rarely achieved. In general, we're pretty incomplete and inharmonious collections of drives. So most crucially, Nietzsche thinks that I do not need to have this sort of subjectivity in order to have agency. So he writes in Genealogy of Morals, Essay 1, Section 13, "There is no being behind the doing, affecting becoming. The doing is simply fabricated into the doing is everything." So fourthly, my claim that Nietzsche characterizes drives as acting in accordance with a will to power. So in keeping with the previous point about subjectivity, will to power speaks directly through the drives, not through some intermediate subject. It's simply the drives themselves that exert themselves. And he writes in a Nachlass passage of 1887 to 88, valuation itself is only this will to power. To criticize being from the standpoint of one of these values is absurd and misleading. Even supposing it ushers in a process of decline, it is a process which still stands in the service of that will. Now, there's much controversy about how to interpret Nietzsche's conception of will to power, but I'm going to claim that the following features are central to it. He says that it characterizes all organic life, and sometimes the inorganic world as well. And it is an eminently active force. It is not the drive to persevere in being, if this means self-preservation, but it aims at expansion, appropriation, domination, or colonization. So I'm going to suggest that we can in fact think of drives simply as wills to power in the plural, and this is taking up from an interpretation of Nietzsche's concept of will to power taken from Wolfgang Müller-Lauter, who's emphasized this idea of wills to power as multiple. And there's a passage in which Nietzsche, in fact, says that the drives are reducible to will to power, and that the will to power is the last fact down to which we can reach. So essentially his psychology of drives acting, which is central to his conception of valuing, is simply a conception of wills to power exerting themselves. And so to turn to my fifth point in my characterization, the objects of the drives are variable. Drives are not simply responses to external stimuli, they're things which seek to manifest themselves. So rather than being responses that kick in when some stimulus comes our way, we should think of them as psychic forces that are always already acting in some way. So it's crucial to this conception of drives as forces that seek to express themselves, that rather than going in search of some pre-settled target or aim, they will, under certain conditions, be able to attach themselves to different objects. So we can use Freudian terminology and say that, and distinguish between the aim of the drive and the object of the drive, between the Ziel and the object. So the drive must, as a matter of course, attach itself to some object or other, but it's not settled in advance what this object will be. So the objects of the drives are variable. As Freud puts it, although the ultimate aim of each drive remains unchangeable, there may yet be different paths leading to the same aim. So Nietzsche has a complex account in the Genealogy, Book 2, of a particular way in which this can work, and I think this is crucially part of his way of filling out the connection between valuing and the values that we have, the values that we inherit as intersubjective commands. And so what happens, according to Nietzsche in the second essay of the Genealogy, is that our aggressive drives, our drive for cruelty, is something that is turned inward. This is what he calls the internalization of man. So that the object of the drive is now no longer something outside me, but that is something inside me. And this is going to be crucial in Nietzsche's conception of how we are to change our values. So his overarching normative project is what he calls the revaluation of all values. And the revaluation of all values doesn't simply mean that we go through our list of values and then we pick the ones that we want to keep and reject the ones that we don't, or simply add to the list. It involves the redirection of our drives onto a particular set of objects. So the kind of ways in which our values can be transformed will be analogous to the internalization of man, in the sense that we need to recognize that we have drives, we have wills to power exerting themselves that are to latch onto certain objects. This is just a psychological fact about us. And what we're to do if we're to create new values is to make these latch on to new objects. So with this general account of Nietzsche's drive psychology of valuing in place, I now want to relate this to what we've been saying about Spinoza. So it's clear that, first of all, that Nietzsche can't have recourse to an external model such as Spinoza introduces. He doesn't think that there's any such thing as an ideally rational human being, and he wouldn't consider such an individual worthy of imitation even if such a thing could be conceived. What he does want to do is he wants to produce superior valuers of a certain kind, and this will be part of what happens in the process of the revaluation. There will be these superior valuers who will play a part in creating the new values. But I hesitate to call them exemplary valuers. They're not going to be exemplars in the Spinozistic sense of being models for imitation. So rather, Nietzsche thinks that our valuing can be channeled in such a way as to produce what he sometimes calls higher types. So, as I say, these higher types are not to be thought of as a supremely rational exemplar that we're to imitate. Nietzsche, when he speaks about higher types, often gives a list of examples which tends to include Beethoven, Goethe, and Napoleon. And it's clear that the reasons why he selects these particular types is that they are exemplary, or they are superior in the sense that they're truly unique and original. So there would be no point in trying to imitate Beethoven, and there'd be no point in trying to imitate Goethe, because by trying to imitate them, one's going to, before one's even started, fail to become as great as they were. So Nietzsche ends up with a picture where it will be an outcome of a superior form of valuing that there will be higher types. There will be people who are exemplary in this sense, but they're not going to be models for imitation. And I think this is the perhaps a central difference in terms of how the account pans out in relation to Spinoza's. So in conclusion, I'm going to just make some remarks about criticisms that Nietzsche might point towards this Spinozistic account that we've been outlining, and then Alex is going to have a final word of reply in giving us some of what Spinoza might say in response to Nietzsche. So one objection that Nietzsche is going to direct at Spinoza, we feel, and which I've already alluded to, is Spinoza's difficulties in accounting for individuals such as Beethoven and Napoleon, who appear to model themselves on nobody. So one might think that there are values that escape the structure of emulation associated with the kind of creativity that Nietzsche identifies with will to power. So Nietzsche agrees with Spinoza that one cannot simply find out what one is striving to be by looking into one's inner nature. But the question is Spinoza correct to assume that the only alternative is to locate the target of one's striving in an external model? Can one not, at least in some cases, become what one is, which is Nietzsche's phrase for full self-realization of the kind that Beethoven, Goethe, and Napoleon achieve? Can one not become what one is simply by giving full expression to one's drives and unifying them in the requisite way? And it seems that on the face of it is going to be difficult for Spinoza to account for. Then another line of attack from a Nietzschean point of view is going to be Spinoza's emphasis on concord and agreement as leading us to a superior form of valuing. So Spinoza stresses very much that that human beings, insofar as they are rational, will agree in nature, and the agreement that will result between them is something that is to be valued. And Nietzsche, in fact, in Nachlass note of 1881 refers specifically to Spinoza in this regard and gives us his very much conflicting view. He writes, "How Spinoza fantasizes about reason. A fundamental error is the faith in concord in the absence of struggle. This would be death itself." So if valuation is determined in relation to a model, no understanding of value can guide one in the adoption of a model in the first place. So the question is, what then prevents this all-important act of adoption from reducing to mere arbitrariness? How do we know that in advance that the avoidance of conflict will be a good thing? Nietzsche clearly has a positive valorization of conflict, and there's an independent question of whether he can account for that. But it's not at all clear that we could know in advance that the absence of conflict would be a good thing. So I'm going to hand back to Alex.
Yeah, so the second of those issues seems like a real problem for Spinoza. I mean, effectively, the account that we've tried to give is, for Spinoza, you value what you desire. What do you desire? Well, you desire what you think will bring you closer to your model. And then there's a suggestion in the fourth book of the Ethics that you'd better be very careful about if you had any control over it, about what you choose as a model, because if you choose a model that you're going to end up in inevitable conflict with, that seems like a bad thing. Why is it a bad thing? I mean, that's a valuation, but valuations are supposed to come through desire, and desire is supposed to come through the adoption of a model. So how do you know before you've picked a model that conflict is itself undesirable? That seems problematic. The only kind of response I could imagine Spinoza giving is this sort of quasi-Kantian thing that I pointed out, that if you are aware that the condition of your desiring something is somebody else desiring it in such a way that they'll actually prevent you from getting it, then there's a kind of internal inconsistency in your desire. So then it just seems like there's a kind of fundamental irrationality that arises out of picking a model that could also be an obstacle. But again, I mean, even that, you think, well, why value rationality in that sense? I don't know. So, yeah, conceded to Nietzsche on that one. The point about these sort of superior, if not exemplary figures who seem to model themselves on nobody, who seem to value what they value not by emulating anybody, but somehow by giving free expression to these drives, it seems like you could always reinterpret the data in a more kind of Spinozist way. And I think René Girard, that's a criticism he makes of Nietzsche, is so you take a character like Napoleon. Let's say that Napoleon is the kind of paradigm case of a man who doesn't model himself on anybody. Let's assume he doesn't model himself on Alexander the Great or whatever. He's got an original project, which is his drive to unify Europe. Where did he get that from? Well, he didn't get it from anybody. Well, Girard suggests that you can have these secret forms of emulation that aren't always obvious. And one of them is seeking out conflict. So I think what happens is you have a character who you might interpret as he just kind of lets his will extend itself as far as it can and inevitably finds himself in these conflicts with people. Or you could think such a person has no idea what he wants. The reason he ends up in conflict so much is because the only way that he can sort of settle the question of what he wants is trying to take things from other people and seeing if they resist. If they do resist, then it must mean they value them. If they value them, then it must be valuable. So that's a very different account of what Napoleon is doing. It's not that he has this drive that he then imposes on everyone else. He has no internal drive at all. He just tries to take things from people to see whether they're valuable. So you could tell a similar kind of story, though, in a much sort of more speculative way for somebody like Beethoven. I think, well, Beethoven was so original, he just kind of rejected all of these classical forms. Why did he reject classical forms? Why was it important to him to oppose himself? If he were really indifferent to the things that people were valuing, why wouldn't he have just ignored them as opposed to actively opposing them? So again, conflict might be or opposition or conflict might be a secret, a sort of what's a subtle way of bringing emulation back into the picture. It's a kind of new use of the emulative, a kind of indirect use of emulation to govern your valuing. But that's as much as I can say about how Spinoza might respond to these Nietzschean points. And I think, are we happy to leave it there? Okay, good.
Let others speak.
Moira? You want the microphone, or are you happy to be with it?
I probably do. Can you shout at me if you can't hear me off the back? It's okay. Alex, my question is for you. I thought this presentation of the sociability of desire, the use of Gerard, the use of the exemplar and imitation was incredibly interesting. Very, very, I'd like to think about it some more. However, I'm not sure that your extension of that kind of use of imitation of affects, the contagion of desire, and so on, is properly used in the context of the exemplar of human nature that's used in the preface to Part 4 and the model of the rational man. The reason for that, I think, is that, and this funnily enough goes all the way back, I think, to Ken's question, that in a sense the exemplar is a model that I think is set up as a kind of a hypothetical, a self-aware fiction that is of the schooled imagination. It's schooled, it's disciplined, it's not the automatic imagination of the affects, the imitative affects and so on. But it's a self-aware fiction. And that, remember that was Ken's question, that seems to me important because I would see it as a kind of horizon of aspiration. A little bit like, possibly, and Christoph can, tell me if I'm wrong or right about this, more like the sort of higher type that Beethoven and Napoleon whomever. So even though I think that analysis that you offered is absolutely brilliant, and I've not heard it done like that before, I'm not sure that the imitation of the affects, the notion of emulation, we emulate that which we admire and so on, that whole trap, if you like, of the passions and imagination is what we have in the exemplar of the free man. It seems to me that that is a completely other form of cognitive life wherein one's passions have been transformed, where one gives oneself a fiction. So it's not like, for example, the Imitation of Christ, which I think exactly fits the story that you told. It's, exactly fits that. But, you believe it's, but because you're still caught up in the imagination, you don't realise it's a fiction. So, yeah, although I'm really excited by the analysis, I'm not sure that I can't see why I should believe that it's relevant to this consciously affirmed, hypothetical, aspirational exemplar of the free man.
Okay, thanks. I think, yeah, I can give you some weak pieces of evidence for thinking about the exemplar of human nature in the way that I do. One thing is just purely the language that Spinoza uses. Curly, I think, when he translates this passage about we set for ourselves a model, he says that we may look to. And I thought that's weird. I mean, what does he mean look to? That seems like an odd translation. Well, the word is intueamur. Exemplar humanae natura quod intueamur. That might mean emulate. I mean, I think emulate seems like a better translation for that word than look to. Why would it help just to look at a model of human nature? If you have the idea to be rational, to enjoy this rational life, why not just kind of be rational, just know what rationality is? Why do you have to construct this model? Why does it have to be packaged into the image of a person, an ideal rational person? It just seems like that suggests that there's still the kind of dynamic of emulation going on there. I mean, otherwise, so the point, and I know that this was Paul's part of the paper, but of yours, where you said at the end that Zarathustra stops being a teacher and becomes an exemplar, why would that be important? I mean, I thought one reason it's obviously important is that we're much more inclined to do what people do than to do what they say, right? That's why it's important to have a model, not just a teacher in that case. Well, likewise, I mean, if it were just a matter of knowing what human rationality consists in and being rational, why would you need to create this model, this exemplar at all? One explanation of that is that it's because we're naturally emulative. I don't know if that helps, but that's the strongest.
Another explanation is that we're becomings, not beings, and we are constantly striving toward, to being something better, becoming more and more rational or whatever, more and more adequate ideas, striving more, But yeah, it's a longer conversation.
That's true.
It's fine.
I mean, one thing is just you could kind of just see whether you're becoming more rational without having to build for yourself an ideal model of a rational agent. I mean, why do you need that kind of Platonic form to guide you through? Okay, well, yeah. I mean, I can't sort of
Like a model of democracy, so it's an aspiration.
Yeah. I mean, very much a lot turns on the translation of these words, like exemplar and like enjoyable. But yeah, well.
I'm a bit perplexed by the comparison between Spinoza and Girard. Maybe because in my view a comparison between the two, it's strengthening because Spinoza and Girard, in regard to desire, are as similar as an open and a closed door. Girard is
still by door.
Yes, it's the same function, but quite a different effect. If you think of maybe desire in Girard is simply a hyper solution, a key to everything that rejects history. And it has just a function for Girard to legitimate Christianity. Well, in Spinoza, desire is a completely different thing. Spinoza doesn't entrap desire within the theory of desire. Maybe Spinoza is trapped in another trap. It's a kind of Platonic trap. That's why he can write about striving to persevere in being. That's a formula, a slight improvement on Aquinas' formula. It's just, Conatus adds just a bit of effort to the appetitus of Aquinas. And this is the problem with the Platonic trap that is established continuity and being as reference points. And that's why the difference passes through the writings of Nietzsche, who jumps onto another framework, completely different framework. And the will to power is the expression of this framework. I agree with you, it's difficult to define the will to power, and especially in the English translation, power acts as a sign, a kind of Rorschach text. Everyone projects onto this word whatever he wants. But in the case of Nietzsche, probably we could say that power could be Macht could be translated in a different way as the ability to act upon the world. And in this case, with this translation, we jump out of the Platonic framework because we are no longer talking about entities. We are no longer talking about continuities. If we come back to values, I wonder if we can simply consider the practice of valuing, an important practice. So that for Nietzsche, this is simply a way of improving our ability to deal with the world, or act upon the world.
I don't know who should answer this. Should we both answer it?
Why don't you back that?
Okay. I mean, I don't have that much to say. I think the difference between Spinoza and Girard that you point out, definitely Spinoza doesn't articulate a single theory of desire that then carries through the whole of his work. I gave what I thought was the best argument I can give that theory would explain a lot about what Spinoza says about desire. So it's not just striving to persevere in our being. Like, I mean, just to sort of repeat what I already said, striving to persevere in our being, well, striving to persevere in being what, right? It just begs that question. Secondly, Spinoza says that desire is striving to persevere in our being plus consciousness of that striving. Well, how do we become conscious of that striving? Not through introspection. That's impossible. He rules that out. So I thought that the kind of mimetic theory is probably the best you can do. I don't think that Girard's whole theory of desire is created just for the purpose of justifying Christianity. But I suppose I'd have to know more about why you think that. I mean, you know, Thorstein Veblen had the same theory of desire, and then he wasn't trying to justify Christianity with it. But I think that's about as much as I can say on that. I'll let Christoph handle.
I'll just say something about Nietzsche and will to power. So, I mean, we're in no way arguing that there's any ontological, there's any set of ontological commitments that are shared by Spinoza and Nietzsche, and certainly not when it comes to will to power. And as I said, there are many ways of conceiving of will to power, but really the only element that's essential to the picture that I was trying to paint of Nietzsche's drive psychology of valuing, which is I think that the account that he, if we put the most consistent interpretation on the Nachlass notebooks that emerges, I think it's completely consistent with that picture of the drive psychology of valuing that wills to power, as you say, are among other things means of increasing our ability to act. So I see no conflict between that conception of will to power and the way in which I described will to power as operating in valuing.
Simon?
Thank you. I thought those were two really interesting and illuminating presentations. But I had a question which is sort of one to both of you, which is that I didn't hear any expression of the active-passive, reactive-active dichotomy that I find is common to both Nietzsche and Spinoza. And similarly, a kind of a therapeutic agenda, which is, as it were, to try to get from the reactive emotions, which Spinoza also, just like Nietzsche, wants, insofar as he has a normative agenda, to get us away from. So resentment, hatred, fear, and so on, and to convert those through a process of understanding into active emotion. And in that process, there are possibilities, it seems to me. I'm not a Spinoza expert, so I'll defer to you on that, but I think there are possibilities in Spinoza for introspection in that process. I mean, understanding, what it is that one's feeling, and through a process of understanding, to achieve this therapeutic goal. So can you both somehow comment, because, as I say, that dichotomy was sort of lacking in both your presentations. It seems to me to be central to both philosophies.
Say something about Nietzsche. Just on Nietzsche, I think I have a fairly short answer to your question, which is that, I mean, it's clear that the dichotomy between active and reactive is absolutely central to Nietzsche's psychology. And I think that that can be accommodated within this overall picture of will to power, in the sense that where the drives that are expressions of will to power are unified and organized in the maximally efficient way, in the way in which they maximally harness the will to power that the drives individually manifest. That makes us as active as we can possibly be. And so those cases where human beings are reactive are cases in which those wills to power haven't been harnessed in such a way. So I would see that as very much falling out of the picture of will to power that I tried to sketch.
I'm sorry. Could you actually ask again what the why I should have talked about action and passion in Spinoza in order to present this?
Well, for example, when you end up by saying that these two theories of value that you compute to Spinoza really, in a sense, reduced to the same, so that we actually have really only one, how would you put it? I don't have a note of that.
One theory of valuing.
Yeah, one theory of valuing. And it seems that, the simple desire satisfaction model that we call things good because we desire them, in a sense, is perhaps more in the passive camp, to put this, very telegraphically, and that the idea of good as being what brings us nearer to a model of human perfection, and ultimately perhaps the capacity to understand the whole, I'm an intellectualized theory and so on, could be put more into the active camp. So I just mean that perhaps you're not introducing that dichotomy plays a role in my view, not entirely justified in reducing his theory of value to this one thing.
Yeah.
That's as much as I can say now.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I wonder if I could just... I wasn't suggesting that there was no difference between the account of valuing given in the third book and the account of valuing given in the fourth book, but what I was suggesting was that it's not structurally different. In both cases, whether we value something because we desire it or whether we value something because we think it brings us nearer to a model of perfection, the same thing is happening, which is we set a model before ourselves and we try to emulate that model. So, but the difference is the kind of model that you choose, and maybe I could account for the passivity of the third part account and the activity of the fourth part account in terms of the different types of models. Especially because in the third part, I mean, what I was suggesting was that the problem with choosing a model that you interact with is that you kind of inevitably going to end up in conflict with it, and also that. I mean, you are more passive, right? You see the model, you don't have very much control over the model, whereas I suppose where the model is the product of your own reflection, you've got a bit more control over it. But I'd have to think about that a lot more.
No, Donald, you go.
Good, thanks. So I shared Mara's reservations about your application of the account to the preface to part 4, but I want to sort of go back even farther than that. I'm not quite as sold on the mimetic model of desire in general that you offer. So the account is that desire is to be understood in terms of my emulation of some model which supplies the content of the desire, sort of gives it a directedness. And so 2 points about that. One, the use you make of 3P31 corollary. I think what Spinoza says there is that I desire that others should agree with me, not that I determine my desires by emulating them. So it sort of seems to be backwards, your account of it, right? I already have a certain desire for something, but I desire that others should desire in the same way as I do, right? So it looks like it doesn't explain why I have the desires I have. Now, maybe there's more you could say about that, but at least on the face of it, that's my reading of the text, so that's one point. The second point, and this sort of connects up to the last question about active desire, right, or endogenously generated desire. I mean, you don't really have an account of that, and Spinoza does, and so this is desires that arise from reason, as he calls them. The only thing we desire from reason is understanding, right, which seems to be internally generated. And just one passage, I just picked at random, there's lots of them. He says, a desire that arises from reason, that is, which is generated in us insofar as we act, is the very essence or nature of man, insofar as it is conceived to be determined to doing those things which are conceived adequately through man's essence alone. So this seems to be an account that these are active desires which arise in us from our essence and don't in any way presuppose our emulating another example. They just come from within us, right? And just one final point on that, you know, you also appeal to evidence about us not knowing our own mind. And that's true, I think, in the case to the extent that we're passive and we have inadequate ideas, right? But he also says in 4p52 that the one thing we can understand adequately about our own mind, we can understand it insofar as it has adequate ideas, and insofar as it's productive of adequate ideas, and insofar as we are a power of understanding, we can understand our own mind to that extent. So it does seem to me that there's some evidence for another account of desire, and it might be an account that is limited to active desires, the desire for understanding, that doesn't follow the mimetic model that you laid out here.
Sure. Okay. The first point, I guess I went over that too quickly. It's very true that 3p31c suggests that we desire that others have our desires, not that we receive it as a. But what I think that people don't pay enough attention to is these quotations from Ovid, which are meant to explain why that's the case. Now, they don't say anything about us having a natural desire to project our own desires onto other people or to be emulated. They say something about. They say that a person who can love what someone else is indifferent to must be made of iron. So the condition, that's suggesting what I'm saying, that the condition of us loving the thing is that others love it. That's why we seek for others to. So effectively what Spinoza is saying in saying that we want other people to love what we love is we are looking for models. That a desire for something just withers away unless it's sustained by the presence of others who are acting as models. But I think that emulation goes both directions in this. It's not as kind of straightforward.
It sounds like reinforcement rather than emulation.
Yeah, and I think that's true. So I mean, that may be a big difference between the Girardian account, which is hardcore, just desire is pure emulation, and Spinoza's, which I think is much weaker. I guess there's a sense in which also it's important that I'm not suggesting that your actual striving to, the things you actually strive for are emulative. That wouldn't make any sense for what Spinoza says. But your consciousness of them is generally developed through emulation, because at least up until the third book, it seems like your only source of information about your own striving is really your affects. Now, there might be a way to sort of infer your own striving from your affects other than just kind of looking at external models. So I think that, you're right and Moira's right, that there might be something much more kind of complex going on than I made it sound with the fourth part account, that you just kind of create this fictional model and then emulate it. I think that's true, but I still think it's in the same sort of domain of psychological theory, the fourth part account, as the third part. I don't think there's as much of a gap between the desire satisfaction account of valuing and the model approaching account of valuing, as people suggest. So if anything, I want to bring the desire satisfaction account closer to whatever's going on in the fourth part, rather than trying to make the fourth part fit within a kind of completely Girardian theory. I don't know whether that's a satisfying answer. But
do you have anything more to say about desires from reason or desire for understanding?
Well, I mean, The idea that desires arise in us because of our essence, because of the kind of essence that we have, doesn't seem to me to be completely incompatible. So it might be that the reason they arise is ultimately because of the kind of creatures we are, but still the mechanism by which they arise involves emulation. I don't see why that couldn't be possible, right? I mean, do you see what I mean?
Not really. I don't understand how the desire for understanding is related to emulation at all, actually. I seek to understand something because I don't understand. I want to understand it. Right? How is that related to emulation?
Why do you want to understand?
Because I don't understand.
No, because 3P9S says that desire is striving to persevere in being, along with consciousness and striving. All desire is fundamentally the desire to be. All desire has to originate from your striving to persevere in being. There's no fundamental, base level desire for understanding, Spinoza. Everything is subordinated to your desire to be a certain kind of thing. So you want to be a certain kind of thing, a thing that understands. Well, where do you get your notion of a thing that understands? From a model. That's the...
It's a big topic.
Okay.
I think I can talk loudly enough. Much of what I wanted to say has already been said. I have this problem as well with the notion of emulation. And I guess, you know, I think Spinoza feels that desire is our essence. And it's conatus as well, so almost I am desire. And this idea that there has to be a what seems to displace what Spinoza is saying about being a desiring thing, almost yourself. And when you sort of finished by saying that I desire, or I persevere in my, I strive to persevere in my ability to get closer to my model. And my sense is more that I strive to get closer to my own nature, which is bigger nature. And that is what the work that I have to do through thinking. That's my work. So I feel like the sort of work of thinking and understanding is being lost in the idea that I'm striving to be a thing or to be a what. It doesn't have to be about something, I guess. Can I just be a I am desire in a Spinoza sense?
I can't make sense out of that idea, but I don't want to, take my failure of imagination as an insight into necessity. I can't make sense out of the idea that I could just strive to be without there being some content to what it is that I'm striving to be. I mean, again, if I go to the taxidermist and get myself stuffed, I'm continuing to be something. But that doesn't seem to be the right account of what I desire. So what I think is that you're right. The first thing you said, I think, is absolutely right. You want to exist as your nature. You want to exist as the thing that you really are. But how do you know what that is? I think the source of your knowledge has got to be some model, either some model that you just find in the world or some model that you rationally construct in some way. That's
my sense is Spinoza would say if I am feeling joy, I'm kind of going back to the joy that I spoke of yesterday, if I'm feeling an increase of my power, my ability to act in the world, then it's working for me. And if I'm feeling sorrowful and I'm feeling my energies and my ability to act depleted and I'm becoming more passive, then it's not working. And that's the measure. In my readings, Spinoza myself.
Yeah, I have two different kinds of problems with that sort of view. The first is just with the very idea that so R.G. Collingwood, interestingly, I was going to quote him, but he has this point as well that, look, I mean, introspection can't be your source of knowledge of what you're striving for. He says, come, we all know the hectoring voice, think, tell me what you want. He says that can only do untold damage to try to force people to do that. And his answer is trial and error. That's how we find out what we want. We try things out and we see whether they give us joy or not. Now I think that's conceptually very problematic for reasons that I can't really go into now. Basically, Wittgenstein private language type objections to the idea that joy could just be this re-identifiable sign. But I'm not, I shouldn't say that. The reason I don't think it's right as an interpretation of Spinoza is I think because he explains joy in terms of desire and not the other way around. So he thinks that we experience joy when our desire is satisfied. So you need to know what you desire before you know that you're experiencing joy, rather than knowing that you're experiencing joy in order to find out what you desire. But that's contentious, and
It's very contentious because you don't need to think that you have to rationally identify what it is that you desire in advance. So your mimetic model, there's a really interesting tension, isn't there, between these two kind of views, and it's interesting to think about why it is that and I think one of the weaknesses is the contrast that's drawn between the notion of interiority, and because we don't do it in an interior way, this notion of self-reflection, the alternative is the mimetic model. And the notion of joy, that somehow I'm coming into a situation where I'm in a certain relationship and I recognize that my joy or my feeling is being depleted, gives you a sense of the way that you're becoming or not becoming. So the kind of process of the notion of kind of active desire, or notions of passions as active and somehow within, that notion of internal and external that you're framing emerges out of a much later kind of rationalist reading of Spinoza. And Spinoza is actually in critique of that by trying to bring you into a different relationship, so that you're actually aware of your desires, or aware of the way that your energy or your joy or your feeling is depleted because you're in a certain kind of situation. And that challenges that internal external distinction. Sorry to... But I think that's why, and I think it's a really interesting difference.
Let's give them a chance to talk. Do you want to have a very quick response? Or?
I'm not sure that I can.
Okay, then we'll go.
I will withdraw my question and then ask it afterwards in the roundtable discussion so that you can answer.
Okay, we have two more questions.
Okay.
Could you really get straight to the question and be very brief?
I'll try to be as quick as I can. I'm slightly hesitant about raising this point because it takes us into the most difficult part of the ethics, where what Spinoza means is at its least clear, and it's in many ways least sympathetic. But there isn't just a part 3 and a part 4 account of desire, there's a part 5 account, where we desire to increase what we know in the second and third ways, and we desire to increase the activity of our bodies in order to maximise our chances of post-mortem survival. And that's actually quite difficult to have an emulative account of, I think.
I agree. I think that, I could try, but I can't now. I mean, I did sort of originally start writing stuff about part 5, but I
Thank you. I just wanted to ask Christoph if you could say a little bit more about the comments you made about Nietzsche and the sense in which there isn't, you said, an exemplar in Spinoza's sense. So I'm just unclear about whether you're disagreeing with what we said about Zarathustra in particular. So the important question is what's meant there by an exemplar in Spinoza's sense, and I think if that means a type of person to be imitated, we were in agreement with that, and I take it that's what Zarathustra is saying to the disciples when he says, follow my example. That's to say, as an agent and as someone capable of not so much redirecting their drives, but changing the interpretive framework within which they act. So one way I sometimes think about it is a kind of second order exemplar. It's not an exemplary character, but an exemplary agent. But it leads on to the other question that I wanted to ask, and it's probably a larger one, but it's about the model of agency that comes from that conception of persons as assemblages of drives, as you outlined it. And there seems to be something missing about that. And, you know, there's something mechanical about the idea of agents as simply collections of drives, even taking into account the hierarchy and internal structure they may have. And what seems to be missing, again, is precisely the interpretative element, which I take to be the basis of importance for Nietzsche, of the feeling of power.
I'm very glad you asked that first question, because when we were thinking about this paper, I assumed that the candidates for what might be exemplars in Nietzsche would be people like Beethoven, Goethe, and Napoleon. And it was really only when you gave your paper yesterday that I realized that Zarathustra could fulfill that type of a role in a very different way, in particular because he's a fictional character, and because, as you outlined in your paper, one thing that's very important about Zarathustra is this complex relationship that he has to his followers. So he's not somebody that teaches them to be like him, but he's somebody that in some way tries to make the process of emulation come about in a different way. So I guess my answer to your question on that is that I think that Zarathustra interestingly provides the possibility of understanding how an exemplar might function in Nietzsche, in the sense that what Zarathustra offers is there's a kind of criterion that he offers for similarity with him. So one thing that's clear about him is that you mustn't try to simply be like him, because if you try to be like him, you're not like him, because he's unlike everyone else. But because in the third part of Zarathustra, finally he discovers that the way to get his message across is not to preach, but to have his animals through various mediated ways make his followers have the experience that what it is to be like Zarathustra is to affirm eternal return. There we suddenly have a criterion for what it is to be suitably like Zarathustra. So I guess my problem with Beethoven, Goethe, and Napoleon as exemplars is that we really have no determinate way of saying, are we like them or not? Mainly because the thing that seems to be the driving force for saying that they're exemplary is their creativity and their originality. So it seems that, yes, that there's a significant difference with Zarathustra in the sense that we can now see how that different form of emulation might work. And in relation to your second question, one thing that I struggle with in Nietzsche's Nachlass is the role of interpretation, where he often says that drives exert will to power, and they try and impose themselves on other worlds, they try and impose themselves on the world, and this itself is a process of interpretation. And interpretation permeates everything for him. And I think that's something that I've not really grappled with, and that remains a difficulty for me. I take it that Nietzsche's considered view, insofar as there is one in the Nachlass, is that interpretation is something that he can account for in terms of will to power. That this idea of wills to power as being inherently valuative involves for him the idea of them interpreting their environment. But I wouldn't be able to give any defense of how Nietzsche thinks that interpretation follows from that. But I do very much think that in those types of passages that he thinks that interpretation is something that simply follows even out of this, quite, as you say, mechanistic picture that I outlined, rather than that interpretation enters in some other way.
Could I? I just thought, I feel bad that I didn't give any answer to this question. In fact, it's sort of relevant to the issue of interpretation. Basically, I'll say very quickly what I think is wrong with the idea that we find out what we desire by seeing when we experience joy and saying, okay, well, if I experience joy, then I must have had my desire satisfied. How do you know when you're experiencing joy? So it's this internal impression. You get this sort of internal impression, you say, oh, there it is again, joy. Well, how do you know it's the same thing that you had last time, right? You have no standard for comparison. Nothing makes that true except your belief that it's true. You can't be wrong. If you can't be wrong, then it can't be something that's giving you information. That's basically the problem, but I'll just leave that.
Okay, well, dare I say, we should thank you both for an exemplary presentation.